Sometimes the most broken souls find healing in the most unexpected places. In the mountain town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, the December wind cuts through everything: wool coats, brick walls, and especially the hearts of those who've forgotten what warmth feels like. Victor Dracul hadn't felt cold in 8 centuries, but something about this blizzard chilled even his undead bones as he stood outside Murphy's diner, watching the last of the locals hurry home before the storm hit full force. That's when 2 small figures emerged from the swirling snow like ghosts. The little girl, no more than 8, had eyes older than her years and a fierce grip on her younger brother's hand. "Mister," she said, her voice steady despite chattering teeth, "we need a daddy tonight. Just for tonight. The shelter won't take us alone, but they will if we have a grown-up." Victor, who had commanded armies and toppled kingdoms, found himself speechless. These children didn't know they were asking the king of vampires to be their father. They couldn't know that his touch should terrify them, that his very presence should send them running. Yet here they stood, offering their trust to a monster. What happens when an immortal predator discovers that love might be the one thing more powerful than his curse? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled harder, as if the mountains themselves were warning him away from this moment. Victor stared down at the children, his supernatural senses cataloguing everything about them in milliseconds. The way the girl's pulse hammered beneath skin too pale, the boy's labored breathing that spoke of hunger and exhaustion, the scent of desperation that clung to their worn clothes like smoke. He should walk away. 800 years of existence had taught him that involvement with mortals led only to pain, theirs and his. Yet something in the girl's unwavering gaze held him frozen, something that reminded him of another pair of desperate eyes from a lifetime ago. "Emma, maybe we should try someone else," the boy whispered, tugging at his sister's sleeve. His voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. "There is no one else, Jake." Emma's words cut through the wind with brutal honesty. "Everyone's gone home. The shelter closes at 9, and it's almost 8:47, Victor found himself saying, his voice rougher than intended. He'd been tracking time obsessively all evening, waiting for the last bus that would never come, watching the minutes tick by until he could retreat to whatever cave or abandoned building would shelter him until dawn. Emma's eyes widened, not with fear, but with something that looked suspiciously like hope. "You'll help us?" The logical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through centuries of war and persecution, screamed warnings. He was Victor Dracul, the Shadow King, the nightmare that other nightmares whispered about in the dark. He commanded a network of vampires across 3 continents, owned corporations worth billions, and could level this entire town with a phone call. Playing house with 2 orphaned children was so far beneath him it bordered on absurd. But when Jake stepped closer, his small hand reaching out as if to touch Victor's coat, something unprecedented happened. The boy's proximity sent a jolt through Victor's system, not the usual predatory hunger, but something that felt almost like recognition. Victor took an instinctive step back. This isn't a good idea. Please." Emma moved between them, her stance protective despite her size. "I know you're not like other people, I can tell. But you're not bad. Not like—" She stopped herself, but not before Victor caught the flicker of old terror in her eyes. She knows. The realization hit him like a stake to the chest. Somehow, this child could sense his true nature. In 8 centuries, only a handful of humans had possessed such perception, and most had either gone mad or tried to kill him. Emma did neither. She simply stood there in the swirling snow, offering him something he hadn't been offered in longer than he could remember. Trust. The shelter, he heard himself ask, what exactly do they need? "Just a dad," Jake piped up, his earlier fear forgotten. "Emma says they don't let kids stay alone, but families get rooms. We practiced our story and everything." "What story?" Emma straightened, clearly the leader of this operation. "You're our dad, and we got stranded when our car broke down. We just need one night until the storm passes. Then you can go wherever you were going and we'll figure something else out." The simplicity of it was staggering. No complex schemes, no hidden agendas, just two children asking for 12 hours of safety from a world that had already taken everything from them. Victor glanced toward the warm glow of the emergency shelter 3 blocks down, then back at the children. The smart play was obvious: give them some cash, point them towards social services, and disappear before dawn. He'd survived this long by never getting personally involved in mortal affairs. But Jake chose that moment to shiver violently, and Emma immediately pulled off her own thin jacket to wrap around him, leaving herself in nothing but a threadbare sweater. The gesture, so unconsciously protective, so full of love, stirred something in Victor's chest that he'd thought died with his humanity. "One night," he said quietly. Emma's face transformed, years seeming to fall away as she smiled. "Really?" "One night," he repeated, already questioning his sanity. "But we do this my way. You follow my lead. Don't contradict anything I say, and don't ask questions. Understood?" Both children nodded eagerly. As they began walking toward the shelter, Jake's hand somehow found its way into Victor's. The touch should have been agony. Vampire flesh wasn't meant for human contact, but instead of burning, it felt oddly warm, comforting even. What's your name?" Emma asked, falling into step beside them. For a moment, Victor considered giving her one of his many aliases. Instead, he found himself saying, "Victor." "Thank you, Victor," she said simply. He didn't respond, couldn't respond. Because somewhere between the diner and this snow-covered street, the Vampire King had made a decision that would either damn them all or save him. He just wasn't sure which. The Cedar Falls emergency shelter occupied a converted community center that had seen better decades. Victor assessed it with the cold efficiency of someone who'd spent centuries evaluating potential threats and escape routes. Single-story, brick construction, 2 exits visible from the front approach, the kind of place that would burn fast if things went wrong. What am I doing? The question had been echoing in his mind for the 3 blocks it took to reach the shelter's entrance. This wasn't who he was. Victor Dracul didn't play pretend with mortal children. He ruled from shadows, commanded empires through intermediaries, and kept his existence carefully compartmentalized from anything resembling normal human interaction. His phone buzzed against his ribs, the secure device that connected him to his network of lieutenants across the globe. Probably Marcus calling from the London estate, wondering why his king had gone radio silent. Or perhaps Anastasia from the Prague holdings, requiring authorization for some territorial dispute. The vampire world didn't pause for blizzards or stranded children. Victor let it buzz. "Remember," he said quietly as they approached the glass doors, "I'm your father. We were driving through to visit your grandmother when the car broke down outside town. You don't know how long repairs will take." "What kind of work do you do?" Emma asked, her mind already 3 steps ahead. The honest answer would have required explaining centuries of accumulated wealth, shell corporations and investments that traced back to before America existed. "Business consulting," he said instead, close enough to the truth. Managing a supernatural empire was, technically, business. "Are you married?" Jake's innocent question hit Victor like a physical blow. Was. The word caught in his throat. Alara's face flashed through his memory, golden hair catching candlelight, eyes that had seen past his monster's facade to something worth saving. She'd been dead for over 300 years, but vampire hearts didn't heal the way human ones did. Time didn't dull the ache. It only made it more familiar. "Widowed," he said finally. Emma's hand found his free one, squeezing gently. The gesture was so spontaneous, so full of understanding, that Victor nearly pulled away. He wasn't used to comfort. The Vampire King didn't need sympathy from children. But he didn't let go. The shelter's interior buzzed with controlled chaos. Families clustered around folding tables, sharing donated meals and watching a small television in the corner. The air carried scents of industrial coffee, canned soup, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from people pushed past their limits. Victor's enhanced senses catalogued everything: 43 heartbeats, stress hormones thick in the air, the night manager's elevated blood pressure, 2 children running low-grade fevers. Normal human problems, the kind he typically observed from a distance, if at all. "Can I help you folks?" A tired-looking woman approached from behind a makeshift check-in table. Her name tag read Sarah, and her smile carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to find hope in small victories. "Victor Dracul," he said, letting his natural authority color his voice without crossing into supernatural compulsion. "My children and I need shelter for the night. Our vehicle broke down." Sarah's gaze moved between them, taking in Emma's protective stance and Jake's obvious fatigue. Victor found himself holding his breath, an unnecessary action for someone who didn't technically need to breathe. Everything hinged on this moment. One suspicious look, one probing question, and this entire charade would collapse. "Of course," Sarah said warmly. "Bad night to be stranded. Let me get you set up." As she turned to gather paperwork, Victor caught Emma staring at him with something approaching wonder. Not because he'd fooled the shelter worker, but because he'd used his real name again. In his world, names held power. True names could be weapons in the wrong hands. Yet twice now, with these children, he'd offered his without thinking. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first genuine thing he'd done in decades. His phone buzzed again. Then again. The vampire world was calling, demanding his attention, reminding him of responsibilities that spanned continents, territorial disputes that could spark wars, financial empire that required constant oversight, political maneuvering that kept his kind hidden from mortal authorities. All of it felt impossibly distant from this moment, standing in a small-town shelter, pretending to be an ordinary father with 2 extraordinary children, who somehow made his ancient heart remember what warmth felt like. "Here we go." Sarah returned with forms and room keys. "You'll be in room 7. Breakfast is at 8, and we'll have someone check on the road conditions first thing in the morning." Victor accepted the key, his fingers careful not to brush against Sarah's. Even through his gloves, direct skin contact with most humans caused them discomfort they couldn't quite explain. Another reminder of the vast gulf between his world and this one, but Jake's hand was still in his, small and trusting and impossibly warm. "Thank you," Emma told Sarah with genuine gratitude. As they followed signs toward their assigned room, Victor wondered what he'd set in motion. One night he'd promised. 12 hours of playing human, then back to his real existence. It should have been simple. Nothing about this felt simple anymore. Room 7 was a converted classroom that had been hastily transformed into emergency housing. 2 cots flanked a smaller rollaway bed, thin blankets folded with military precision. A card table held bottled water and what looked like donated toiletries. Through the single window, Victor could see the storm intensifying, snow whipping horizontally across the parking lot. Jake immediately claimed the rollaway bed, bouncing once before Emma shot him a warning look. "Sorry," he whispered, settling into stillness that spoke of hard-learned lessons about drawing unwanted attention. Victor found himself cataloging details that shouldn't have mattered. The way Emma automatically checked the room's corners, looking for threats or exits. How Jake's shoulders finally relaxed for the first time since Victor had met him. The faint scent of lavender soap from whoever had last laundered these blankets. Human things. Mortal concerns. His phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. Victor pulled it out, glancing at the screen. 7 missed calls from Marcus, 3 from his New York holdings, 2 from contacts in the European territories. Each represented problems that couldn't wait, decisions that only the Vampire King could make. "Is that work?" Emma asked, settling cross-legged on one of the cots. "Something like that." The phone rang in his hand. Marcus again. Victor stared at the display, thumb hovering over the answer button. In his world, ignoring calls meant showing weakness. It meant territories left undefended, enemies emboldened, carefully maintained balances of power shifting in dangerous directions. But Jake had fallen asleep the moment his head hit the pillow, one small hand still clutched around the edge of his blanket. The sight stirred something protective in Victor's chest, an emotion so foreign and unexpected that it took him a moment to recognize it. He declined the call. "You don't have to stay," Emma said quietly, watching him with those two knowing eyes. "We'll be safe here. If you need to go, handle your business." Victor studied her face, seeing exhaustion beneath the careful composure. This child had been carrying the weight of survival for weeks, making decisions no 8-year-old should have to make. And she was still trying to protect him from inconvenience. "I said one night," he replied, settling into the room's single chair. "I keep my promises." Emma smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her, and began arranging her few possessions with methodical care. A worn hairbrush, a small paperback book with a cracked spine, a photograph she clutched briefly before tucking it beneath her pillow. Victor's enhanced vision caught the image in that brief moment. A young woman with Emma's dark hair and Jake's gentle eyes, laughing at some long-ago joke. Their mother, he realized, dead weeks ago, according to their story outside the diner. The grief hit him unexpectedly, not his own. He'd learned to carry that particular burden centuries ago, but theirs. Fresh and raw and devastating in the way that only mortal loss could be. Vampires lived with the certainty that everyone they loved would eventually die. These children had believed their mother would be there forever. His phone lit up with a text message, then another. Victor glanced at the screen and felt his blood turn to ice. Territorial breach in Cedar Falls. Local authorities requesting immediate guidance. Situation escalating. Unknown supernatural signature detected in your vicinity. Orders? "Sir, we have 3 hunters moving into the area. Radio silence is concerning the council." Victor stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the storm had become a wall of white, but his supernatural senses pushed through the natural chaos to something else, something that didn't belong in this quiet mountain town. He was no longer the only predator in Cedar Falls. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. His presence here, an ancient vampire of his power level, would have registered on supernatural sensing networks across several states. Every hunter, every rival territory, every ambitious young vampire looking to make a name for themselves would be converging on this location. He'd brought war to a shelter full of innocent people. "Victor?" Emma's voice was sharp with sudden alertness. "What's wrong?" He turned to find her sitting up, eyes wide, not with confusion but with the same inexplicable awareness she'd shown outside the diner. She could sense the danger approaching, which meant she was in more danger than either of them had realized. "We need to leave," he said quietly, already running calculations. How many exits, how quickly he could evacuate the building, whether his car would start in this weather. "The storm will be the least of our problems in about 30 minutes. Emma was already moving, gathering their meager possessions. "Jake," she whispered, shaking her brother awake. "We have to go." But as Victor reached for the door handle, Jake sat up and said something that stopped him cold. "The bad angels are coming, aren't they?" Victor stared at the 6-year-old boy who shouldn't have been able to sense supernatural threats, who shouldn't have known to call them angels, who was looking at Victor with complete trust, despite apparently knowing exactly what he was. Everything had just changed. Again. Victor's hand froze on the door handle, Jake's words echoing in the sudden silence. Bad angels. The child's innocent terminology sent ice through Victor's veins, not because it was wrong, but because it was terrifyingly accurate. In centuries of supernatural warfare, he'd heard vampires called many things: demons, monsters, parasites. But angels? Only the very old texts used such language, describing vampires as fallen celestial beings cast down for their pride. How could a 6-year-old mortal child know terminology that existed only in manuscripts locked away in the deepest vaults of vampire libraries? "Jake," Emma whispered urgently, but Victor caught the sharp look of warning she shot her brother. She knew. Whatever Jake was revealing, Emma had been trying to keep it hidden. Victor released the door handle and turned slowly, his ancient mind racing through possibilities. These weren't random orphans who'd approached him by chance. The probability of encountering two children with supernatural awareness in a town like Cedar Falls was astronomical. Unless they were meant to find me. The thought should have sent him into immediate defensive mode. 8 centuries of survival had taught him that coincidences were usually traps, and traps were usually fatal. But looking at Jake's sleepy confusion and Emma's protective stance, Victor felt something far more dangerous than suspicion. He felt responsible for them. His phone erupted in a cacophony of buzzes and rings. Messages flooded the screen faster than he could read them, but the fragments he caught painted a clear picture: multiple contacts converging, hunters mobilizing, breach protocols activated. "We have maybe 20 minutes, Victor said, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos building in his chest. He moved to the window, scanning the storm-shrouded landscape with supernatural senses that could pierce the darkest night. There, movement that didn't match the wind patterns, shapes approaching from 3 different directions, moving with predatory purpose through the blizzard. At least 2 vampires, their cold signatures distinct against the winter air, something else that felt older, more dangerous, and threading between them, the peculiar emptiness that marked professional hunters, humans who'd learned to mask their presence from creatures like him. "Victor," Emma's voice was steady, but he caught the tremor beneath. "If we leave now, in this storm, Jake won't make it. He's not strong enough." Victor looked at the boy, seeing details he'd missed before. The hollows beneath his eyes spoke of more than ordinary hunger. Jake's breathing carried a slight wheeze that suggested weeks of poor nutrition and exposure. Emma was right, dragging him into a blizzard while supernatural predators closed in would be murder. But staying meant turning a shelter full of innocent families into a war zone. Victor's fingers tightened around his phone as another message arrived, local pack leader offering assistance. Terms negotiable. Werewolves. Of course. Cedar Falls sat at the intersection of several territorial boundaries, which explained why his presence had triggered such rapid response. Every supernatural faction within 100 miles would be mobilizing, either to destroy him or to claim the prestige of harboring the Vampire King. None of them would care about collateral damage. "There's something you need to know," Emma said quietly, moving to stand between Victor and her brother. The protective gesture was unnecessary. Victor would never harm Jake, but it spoke to instincts honed by loss and betrayal. "About us. About why we can sense things." Victor's phone rang. Marcus again, probably coordinating defensive measures across the entire network. Victor stared at the display, torn between 8 centuries of careful self-preservation and something he couldn't name. Answering meant acknowledging the crisis, stepping back into his role as the Shadow King. It meant making the hard choices that had kept him alive through wars and political upheavals. It meant treating these children as acceptable casualties. He declined the call. "Tell me," he said to Emma, settling back into the chair despite every instinct screaming at him to run. But quickly. Emma glanced at Jake, who had pulled his knees to his chest, watching Victor with those impossibly knowing eyes. "Mom used to say we were blessed," Emma began, "that some families carry old gifts, old responsibilities. She taught us to hide it, to never let anyone know what we could see." "What can you see?" "The truth of things," Jake said softly. "Like how you're sad and scared and trying so hard to be good that it hurts you." Victor's breath caught. In 8 centuries, no one had looked at him and seen anything beyond the monster. Fear, yes. Respect, certainly. Even admiration from those who valued power above all else. But Jake was seeing something deeper, something Victor had thought buried beneath centuries of necessary cruelty. His phone buzzed with a priority alert. "First contact in 12 minutes. Recommend immediate evacuation." 12 minutes to decide between the survival instincts that had carried him through 8 centuries of darkness and 2 children who somehow saw light in him that he'd forgotten existed. Victor looked at Emma's determined face, at Jake's trusting smile, at the storm raging beyond the window. For the first time in his immortal existence, the Vampire King had absolutely no idea what to do. Victor's phone slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor as Jake's words settled into his ancient bones. Trying so hard to be good that it hurts you. 800 years of careful masks, of calculated cruelty disguised as necessity, and this child saw through it all to something Victor had convinced himself no longer existed. The weight of centuries pressed down on him. Every compromise, every necessary evil, every choice that had carved away pieces of his humanity until only the monster remained. He'd told himself it was survival. He'd told himself it was pragmatic. He'd told himself that compassion was a luxury the Vampire King couldn't afford. But Jake saw goodness. Jake saw someone trying. Outside, the storm howled with increasing fury, but beneath its natural chaos, Victor's supernatural senses tracked the approaching threats. 10 minutes now, maybe less. The werewolf pack moving in from the east would arrive first. They'd want to negotiate to position themselves as protectors in exchange for territorial concessions. The hunters from the south were still struggling through the worst of the blizzard, but their equipment would cut through supernatural defenses like heated blades through ice. And the vampires? The vampires were here for him personally. Victor retrieved his phone with hands that had orchestrated wars across 3 continents, fingers that had signed treaties in blood and shadow. The screen showed 17 missed calls, 43 urgent messages, and a red priority alert that made his stomach turn to ice council vote initiated. Emergency succession protocols activated pending your status confirmation. They thought he was dead or compromised. In either case, the carefully balanced empire he'd spent centuries building was about to tear itself apart. Rival factions would move against his territories within hours. The financial networks that kept his kind hidden from mortal authorities would collapse. 800 years of work, undone by one night of playing human. "Victor?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You're scaring Jake." He looked up to find the boy watching him with wide eyes, small hands pressed against his chest as if trying to hold back some invisible pain. The sight hit Victor like a physical blow. Jake was somehow feeling his anguish, absorbing the weight of centuries through whatever supernatural gift ran in their bloodline. "I'm sorry," Victor whispered, forcing his expression into careful neutrality. But it was too late. Jake had already seen inside him, past the monster's mask, to the soul that screamed in constant torment. His phone rang again. This time he answered. Sir Marcus's voice carried barely controlled panic. "The entire eastern seaboard is mobilizing. If you don't extract immediately, cancel all defensive protocols," Victor said quietly. Silence. "Then, sir, you heard me. Stand down the networks. Let them come." "Victor," Marcus's voice dropped to urgent whisper, "you're talking about suicide. The Council will move against your territories the moment they confirm you've gone rogue. Everything we've built will survive without me." The words felt strange on Victor's tongue. For 8 centuries, he'd believed himself indispensable, the keystone holding together an empire built on fear and careful balance. Initiate the Lazarus protocols, transfer primary authority to the inner circle, make it clear this is temporary, not succession. How temporary? Victor looked at Emma, who was listening with the careful attention of someone far older than her years. At Jake, whose small hand had somehow found its way into his again. At the storm beyond the window that held dozens of innocent families hostage to supernatural politics they couldn't comprehend. "I don't know," he admitted. The line went quiet, except for Marcus's sharp breathing. In the background, Victor could hear alarms, urgent voices coordinating responses that might already be too late. His empire, his life's work, dissolving into chaos while he sat in a converted classroom holding the hand of a child who saw angels and demons with equal clarity. "Sir," Marcus said finally, "whatever's happening there, is it worth this?" Victor studied Jake's face, seeing impossible depths in 6-year-old eyes. Emma had called them blessed, carriers of old gifts and older responsibilities. Their mother had taught them to hide what they could see, which meant their bloodline had survived long enough to learn caution. That spoke of power, real power, the kind that attracted attention from things far worse than territorial vampires, the kind of power that might explain why supernatural threats were converging on Cedar Falls during the worst blizzard in decades. "Marcus," Victor said, making a choice that terrified him more than facing down elder vampires, "I need you to research bloodlines connected to the name." He looked at Emma. "What was your mother's maiden name?" Emma hesitated, then whispered, "Thorn." Victor's phone slipped from nerveless fingers for the second time. The Thorn bloodline. Guardians who'd stood between the mortal and supernatural worlds for over 1,000 years. Protectors whose gifts had been legend even when Victor was newly turned. They were extinct, had been for 3 centuries, except they weren't. Outside, shapes moved through the storm with predatory purpose. Inside, 2 children who shouldn't exist watched him, with eyes that held starlight and shadow in equal measure. Victor Dracul, Vampire King, Shadow Lord of the Eastern Territories, had just committed himself to protecting the last heirs of his kind's most ancient enemy. There was absolutely no going back. Tests and allies. Victor bent to retrieve his phone, movements deliberate despite the chaos screaming through his immortal mind. The Thorn bloodline. The implications rewrote everything he thought he understood about this night, about these children, about the convergence of supernatural forces that had seemed like territorial politics 5 minutes ago. The Thorns hadn't been mere humans with gifts. They'd been the bridge between worlds, guardians whose power had kept the supernatural realm from bleeding into mortal reality. Their bloodline had produced warriors who could stand against elder vampires, healers who could purify corruption with a touch, seers who could read the threads of fate itself. They'd also been hunted to extinction for those very gifts. Victor's fingers closed around his phone as Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker. "Sir? Sir!" The connection cut out. "What about the Thorn name?" "Research everything," Victor said quietly, watching Emma's face pale at his tone. "Genealogies, surviving records, any mention in the last 3 centuries. Cross-reference with recent deaths in Colorado mountain towns. The Thornegard? Victor, they've been gone since—" "Apparently not." Victor ended the call as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their room. Heavy, deliberate steps that spoke of authority and barely contained violence. Emma grabbed Jake's hand, pulling him behind her in a gesture Victor recognized from his own centuries of survival. The stronger protecting the weaker, regardless of the odds. "We need to hide," she whispered. "Too late for that," Victor replied, rising to his feet. The supernatural signatures beyond the door were complex. Werewolf, definitely, but accompanied by something older, something that made his ancient bones itch with recognition and dread. A knock rattled the door. Polite, controlled, but with enough force to suggest the politeness was purely decorative. "Victor Dracul," a woman's voice called through the thin wood. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Emma's grip tightened on Jake's hand. "Who is it?" "Pack leader," Victor murmured, though that wasn't entirely accurate. The voice carried authority that went beyond simple werewolf hierarchy, and something else. The door opened, despite Victor not granting permission. A woman stepped inside, shaking snow from dark hair that hung to her shoulders. She wore practical winter gear over what Victor's enhanced senses identified as tactical armor. Early 30s, perhaps, with the kind of lean strength that spoke of constant training and frequent violence. Behind her stood a man who made Victor's supernatural instincts scream warnings. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that held too much knowledge and hands that bore scars Victor recognized from his earliest centuries. Inquisitor markings. This wasn't just a werewolf pack responding to territorial breach. This was an official supernatural tribunal. "Isabella Santos," the woman said, pulling off heavy gloves with economical movements. "Regional coordinator for the Northwestern Territories." And this is Father Coleman, Vatican liaison for supernatural affairs. Victor's blood chilled. The Vatican only sent their specialists for situations involving prophecy or apocalyptic threat levels. There's no need for formal involvement here. I'll be leaving once the storm clears. No, Father Coleman said quietly, his gaze moving from Victor to the children with laser precision. You won't. Jake stepped forward, his small hand slipping into Victor's with complete trust. The contact sent familiar fire through Victor's supernatural nervous system, but instead of pain, he felt something else. Strength, clarity, as if Jake's touch was somehow grounding him in purpose he'd forgotten existed. They're here because of us, Emma said, her voice steady despite the terror Victor could smell rolling off her. Aren't they? Isabella nodded grimly. The Thorn bloodline carries responsibilities that don't end with death, child. Your mother's passing triggered alerts across every supernatural monitoring network on the continent. We've been searching for you for weeks. To help us? Jake asked hopefully. Father Coleman's expression softened slightly. To determine if you pose a threat to the balance between worlds, your bloodline carries significant power. Power that could reshape the supernatural landscape if it falls into the wrong hands. Victor felt every protective instinct he'd thought buried centuries ago surge to violent life. They're children. They're weapons, Isabella corrected, whether they know it or not. The question is whether they'll be wielded by those who understand the stakes involved or by someone whose interests might not align with global stability. Her gaze settled on Victor with unmistakable implication. The Vampire King, notorious for his territorial ambitions and carefully calculated ruthlessness, had just claimed two of the most powerful supernatural assets on the planet. From any objective standpoint, this looked exactly like what it wasn't, a calculated power grab that could shift the balance between vampire territories and werewolf packs across multiple continents. Victor realized with crystalline clarity that his choice to protect these children had just made him the most dangerous person in North America. And everyone in this room knew it. The silence stretched like a blade between them, sharp with implications Victor could feel cutting into 8 centuries of carefully maintained neutrality. Jake's small hand remained in his, radiating that impossible warmth that burned and healed in equal measure, while Emma positioned herself between the adults and her brother with the instinctive protectiveness of someone who'd learned to expect betrayal. You misunderstand my position, Victor said finally, his voice carrying the controlled calm that had negotiated truces between warring supernatural factions. This isn't acquisition, it's protection. Isabella's laugh held no humor. The Vampire King doesn't protect, he consolidates power, he calculates advantage. He what? Victor interrupted, something dangerous flickering in his ancient eyes. Sacrifices innocence for political gain? Treats children as chess pieces? His gaze swept between Isabella and Father Coleman. How exactly does that differ from what you're proposing? Father Coleman stepped forward, his scarred hands clasped behind his back in a gesture Victor recognized from Inquisitor's past. We're proposing proper guardianship by trained professionals who understand the scope of their abilities. The Church has protocols, safe houses designed specifically for bloodlines like theirs. Prisons, Emma said quietly. You mean prisons? The priest's expression didn't change, but Victor caught the micro-expression that confirmed Emma's assessment. Safe houses with armed guards and supernatural containment fields, protection that looked remarkably like incarceration. Victor's phone buzzed against his palm, incoming force ETA 6 minutes. Recommend immediate negotiation or extraction. 6 minutes to resolve a supernatural crisis that had been building for 3 centuries. 6 minutes to protect 2 children from becoming pawns in a game that predated most nations. 6 minutes to choose between the empire he'd built and the impossible hope that Jake saw when he looked at him. There's another option, Victor said, the words forming before his conscious mind had fully processed them. Temporary guardianship, supervised protection while they learn to control their abilities, no separation from each other, no indefinite containment. Isabella's eyes narrowed. Under whose supervision? Yours, if necessary. The commitment terrified him more than facing down elder councils or werewolf war parties. With full transparency, regular check-ins, whatever oversight you require. Victor, Father Coleman said, his voice carrying genuine warning, you're talking about fundamentally altering the balance of supernatural power on this continent. The other vampire houses won't accept it. Your own territories will revolt. The political ramifications will be my responsibility to manage. Victor felt Jake's fingers tighten around his, that strange warmth pulsing like a heartbeat he'd thought silenced centuries ago. These children aren't political assets. They're not weapons to be stockpiled or threats to be neutralized. They're scared kids who've lost their mother and have nowhere else to turn. His phone rang. Marcus again, probably with updated threat assessments and extraction protocols. Victor declined the call without looking. Isabella exchanged glances with Father Coleman, some communication passing between them that spoke of protocols Victor wasn't privy to. You understand what you're proposing, she said finally. Personal responsibility for two of the most potentially dangerous supernatural assets on the planet. No council backing if things go wrong. No territorial protection if other factions decide you've become a threat. You're talking about making yourself a target for every power-hungry vampire, werewolf, and demon lord from here to the Atlantic. Victor looked down at Jake, who was watching the adults with eyes that seemed far too knowing for a 6-year-old. Emma had moved closer, her protective stance unwavering despite facing forces that could casually destroy city blocks. They're worth it, he said simply. The words hung in the air like a confession, stripping away 8 centuries of careful political calculation. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't territorial expansion or power consolidation. This was Victor Dracul, Vampire King, choosing to risk everything for 2 children who somehow saw light in his darkness. Father Coleman's scarred hand moved to the silver cross at his throat, fingers tracing metal that would burn Victor's flesh if touched. There are conditions, he said slowly, requirements that aren't negotiable. Name them. Regular assessments of their abilities and psychological state, immediate notification if their powers manifest beyond current levels, full cooperation with church oversight regarding their training. His gaze intensified. An absolute guarantee that they won't be used to advance vampire political interests. Victor's phone buzzed with an emergency alert. 4 minutes. Multiple factions converging. Window for peaceful resolution closing rapidly. Through the storm-lashed window, Victor could see shapes moving with purpose through the blizzard. His decision here would either diffuse a supernatural crisis or escalate it into open warfare across multiple territories. Jake tugged on his hand, looking up with those impossible eyes. You're scared, he said softly, but not of them. You're scared of being good. The simple observation hit Victor like a physical blow, stripping away centuries of careful emotional armor. Jake was right. Goodness was terrifying. Goodness made you vulnerable. Goodness got you destroyed by those who understood that mercy was weakness. But Jake believed he could be good anyway. I accept your conditions, Victor said. The weight of those 4 words settled over the room like a death shroud. Victor felt the ancient foundations of his existence cracking beneath him. 8 centuries of calculated cruelty, of survival through strength and fear, dissolving in the space of a child's trust. Father Coleman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. You understand what you've just committed to? The church doesn't make these agreements lightly. Break our conditions and... I won't. Victor's voice carried absolute certainty that surprised even him. I've spent 800 years being what the world expected me to be. Perhaps it's time to discover what I choose to be instead. Isabella pulled out a satellite phone, her movements sharp with barely controlled tension. I need to contact the regional council immediately. This changes everything about our containment protocols. She glanced at Victor with something that might have been grudging respect, a vampire king accepting church oversight voluntarily. There's no precedent for this. Through the storm-lashed windows, the shapes were moving closer. Victor's enhanced senses picked up the distinct signatures now, 3 separate vampire factions, at least 2 werewolf packs, and something else that made his ancient instincts recoil, something that tasted of sulfur and old fury. His phone rang again. This time when he answered, Marcus's voice carried the sharp edge of absolute panic. "Victor, you have 90 seconds before this becomes a war zone. The Eastern Council just declared you rogue. House Valdris is mobilizing their entire nest. The werewolf territories are treating this as a full-scale territorial breach." Marcus's breathing was labored, as if he was running. "And sir, there are demons, actual demons, not just possessed humans. Whatever those children are, every supernatural predator on the continent wants them." Victor looked down at Jake, who was pressed against his side with complete trust, tiny fingers clutching at Victor's coat. Emma stood sentinel beside them, her young face set with determination that belonged on a warrior 3 times her age. They were counting on him. 2 children who should have run screaming from what he was, instead believing he could protect them from forces that had hunted their bloodline to supposed extinction. "Marcus," Victor said quietly, "implement Protocol 7. Silence. "Then, sir, Protocol 7 that's total territorial abandonment. You'll lose everything. 5 centuries of empire building gone. Execute it." "Victor, please, think about what you're doing. These children, whatever they are, they're worth everything," Victor said, ending the call. Father Coleman had gone very still, his scarred hands clasped so tightly that Victor could hear bones creaking. "Did you just abandon your entire vampire empire for them?" "Temporarily," Victor corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless. "My territories can survive without me. These children cannot." The first explosion lit up the windows like artificial dawn. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, supernatural forces were engaging each other with the kind of violence that would leave scars on the landscape for decades. The emergency shelters building shook, ancient wooden beams protesting against forces they were never designed to withstand. Emma grabbed Jake's other hand, forming a protective chain with Victor at its center. "They're coming for us," she whispered, her supernatural awareness painting pictures that made her young face pale with terror. "All of them. They want to use us." Jake looked up at Victor with those impossible eyes, seeing straight through 8 centuries of darkness to something Victor had thought long dead. "But you won't let them, will you?" The question held the weight of prophecy, of choices that would reshape the supernatural world. In the distance, Victor could hear the distinctive howls of werewolves engaging vampire forces, punctuated by something else, screams that spoke of demonic involvement. This was no longer about 2 homeless children seeking shelter from a storm. This was about bloodlines and prophecies, about power that could redraw the boundaries between mortal and supernatural worlds. This was about Victor Dracul choosing to be a protector instead of a predator, regardless of the cost. "No," Victor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "I won't let them touch you." Father Coleman stepped forward, his hand moving to weapons concealed beneath his coat. "Then we make our stand here. Isabella, how long until reinforcements arrive?" 15 minutes for church tactical teams, 20 for regional council forces. Isabella's fingers flew over her satellite phone's keypad. "But Victor, those shapes outside, some of them are yours, aren't they? Your own vampires coming to retrieve their king?" Victor moved to the window, his preternatural vision cutting through snow and darkness to identify the approaching threats. House Valdris forces to the east, moving with military precision. Werewolf packs from the north and south, coordinating their approach with practiced efficiency. And from the west, his blood chilled, ancient vampires, older than himself, whose names were spoken in whispers even among the undead. The kind of monsters who remembered when the Thorn bloodline had been hunted the first time. They hadn't come to retrieve him. They'd come to finish what their predecessors had started 3 centuries ago. Victor's enhanced senses tracked the ancient vampire's approach with the precision of a death knell. Three figures moved through the blizzard with movements that predated written history. Elder Matthias of the First Blood, whose reign had terrorized Europe before Victor was even born. Lady Seraphina, whose beauty masked appetites that had turned entire kingdoms into feeding grounds, and worst of all, Lord Varus, the last Roman, whose hatred for the Thorn bloodline had festered for 8 centuries. "They're not here for negotiation," Victor breathed, backing away from the window as supernatural pressure crashed against the building like a tidal wave. The shelter's walls groaned under the weight of ancient power, and every light in the building flickered. Emma's screams split the air as her supernatural senses overloaded. They're so hungry. They want to eat our light, make it part of their darkness forever." Jake collapsed against Victor's leg, his small body convulsing as if burned by proximity to such malevolence. Where his skin touched Victor's coat, smoke began to rise, not the gentle warmth from before, but desperate fire trying to ward off approaching evil. "Isabella!" Father Coleman barked into his radio. "How long until—" The front wall exploded inward. Lord Varus stepped through the destruction like death incarnate, snows swirling around him in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Behind him came the others, their forms radiating power that made the air itself recoil. 8 centuries, Varus said conversationally, his voice carrying the weight of empires fallen. 8 centuries I've waited to finish what we started with their ancestors. And you, little king, have delivered them directly into our hands. Victor pushed the children behind him, feeling his own power surge to meet the threat. But even as vampire strength flooded his system, he knew with crystalline certainty that he was outmatched. 3 elder vampires against 1, with innocent lives in the crossfire. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. "The children are under church protection." Father Coleman stepped forward, silver weapons materializing in his scarred hands. "Stand down or face immediate Vatican response." Lady Seraphina laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "The Church's authority ends where prophecy begins, priest. These children carry the power to remake our entire species. They will not waste away in your sanitized safe houses." Isabella's satellite phone screamed with incoming alerts. "Council forces are still 12 minutes out. We have to hold until—" Elder Matthias moved with speed that made Victor look glacial. One moment, he stood by the ruined wall. The next, his claws were wrapped around Isabella's throat, lifting her off the ground with casual contempt. 12 minutes is 11 more than we require." Victor lunged forward, but Varus intercepted him with force that sent him crashing through the shelter's interior walls. As Victor struggled to rise, tasting his own ancient blood, he heard Jake scream his name with desperate terror. "Victor!" The sound drove spikes of anguish through his supernatural heart. These children had trusted him, believed he could protect them, and he was failing them in the most spectacular way possible. All his power, his centuries of accumulated strength, meant nothing against elders who had been apex predators since Rome ruled the world. Emma grabbed Jake's hand, her supernatural awareness blazing with defensive light that made the vampires hiss and recoil. "Stay back! You can't have us!" "Such fire!" Seraphina purred, advancing despite the burning radiance. "It will taste exquisite when we drain it slowly. Your ancestors screamed beautifully when we killed them, child. I expect no less from you." Victor hauled himself upright, ribs knitting back together with agonizing slowness. Through blood-hazed vision, he saw Father Coleman engaging Matthias with sacred weapons, his combat training pushing one of history's deadliest monsters to actual effort. But even enhanced human skill couldn't match supernatural speed for long. The priest stumbled. Matthias struck like a serpent, claws raking across Coleman's chest in sprays of crimson that painted the walls. The man of God hit the floor hard and didn't rise. Isabella's radio crackled with desperate voices, multiple supernatural signatures converging on your position. "Council teams are engaging hostiles but can't break through to your location. Repeat, you are cut off." Victor tried to reach the children, but Varus caught him again. this time pinning him against the far wall with strength that cracked wooden beams. "Did you think your little redemption story would have a happy ending?" The ancient Roman sneered. "You are what you've always been, a predator. The only difference is that now you've developed a conscience to suffer with." Through the haze of pain and desperation, Victor watched helplessly as the other two elders closed in on Emma and Jake. The children's defensive light was fading, their young bodies unable to sustain such power. Emma's determined expression was cracking into the terror of a little girl facing monsters beyond nightmares. Everything he'd promised them, protection, safety, a chance at normal life, was disintegrating before his eyes. He had failed them completely. The revelation. But as Varus's claws tightened around his throat and the elders stalked toward the children, Victor felt something impossible happening inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 8 centuries of undeath. His heart was beating. Not the mechanical pumping of reanimated flesh, but the actual rhythm of life, growing stronger with each pulse. The sound thundered in his ears as Jake's terrified voice cut through the supernatural chaos. "Victor, please, you promised—" The words shattered something fundamental in Victor's understanding of himself. 800 years of believing he was a monster wearing human skin. 800 years of accepting that redemption was a fantasy for creatures like him. All of it crumbled as his heart continued its impossible rhythm. He wasn't just protecting these children out of obligation or strategy. He loved them, completely, desperately, with a depth that defied every natural law governing the undead, and that love was literally bringing him back to life. "Impossible," Varus breathed, his grip loosening as Victor's skin began to warm beneath his claws. "You're still dead. You have to be dead." But Victor could feel mortality flooding through his system like fire, burning away centuries of supernatural cold. His fangs were retracting, his preternatural speed was shifting into something else, not the predatory grace of a vampire, but the protective strength of a father defending his children. Emma's eyes widened as her supernatural senses registered the change. You're becoming human, right now. I can see your soul getting brighter." The revelation hit Victor with the force of prophecy fulfilled. The ancient words that had haunted him for centuries suddenly made perfect sense. The Vampire King's redemption will come through protecting 2 souls whose light could either destroy him or finally grant him the humanity he sought. He had always assumed it meant choosing between his vampiric nature and human mortality. But the prophecy wasn't about destruction or replacement. It was about transformation through love. Seraphina snarled as Victor broke free from Varus with strength that now burned with solar warmth instead of undead chill. "Kill him! Kill him before the change completes!" But as the 3 elders converged on him, Victor realized the most staggering truth of all. He wasn't losing his supernatural abilities, he was transcending them. The power still flowed through him, but purified, transformed from predatory hunger into protective force. He was becoming something that had never existed before, a guardian born from darkness but redeemed by light. Matthias struck first, claws aimed at Victor's heart. Victor caught the ancient vampire's wrist, and where their skin touched, holy fire erupted. The elder screamed as centuries of accumulated evil burned away at contact with Victor's transformed essence. "You're still vampire," Lady Seraphina hissed, circling him like a predator seeking advantage. "Still undead, still ours." "No," Victor said, his voice carrying newfound certainty as his heart continued its mortal rhythm. "I'm something else entirely now." Jake had stopped convulsing, his young face brightening with wonder as he sensed the change. "You're like us now, light and dark together, but the light is winning." The boy was right. Victor could feel his nature settling into something unprecedented, retaining vampiric strength and speed, but powered by love instead of hunger. The transformation wasn't removing his darkness, it was sanctifying it, turning predatory instincts into protective ones. Father Coleman struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his wounds, but his eyes wide with theological amazement. "Dear God, you're not becoming human. You're becoming what vampires were meant to be before the curse corrupted them." Varus roared his fury, launching himself at Victor with the desperate violence of the truly threatened. But Victor moved to intercept him with fluid grace, catching the Roman elder in an embrace that would have seemed almost gentle if not for the holy fire that erupted between them. "This ends here," Victor said, as Varus writhed in his grip, 8 centuries of hatred burning away under the touch of purified darkness. "The hunt for their bloodline ends with me." Through the chaos, Emma grabbed Jake's hand and together they stepped toward Victor, their defensive light now harmonizing with his transformed aura instead of burning him. The 3 of them formed something unprecedented, a family bound not by blood, but by love that had literally rewritten the laws of supernatural existence. Lady Seraphina backed toward the ruined wall, her beautiful features twisted with ancient fear. "What have you become?" Victor looked down at the children who had chosen to trust him despite every reason to run, whose faith had literally brought him back to life, and smiled with fangs that now gleamed like silver instead of ivory. "I've become their father." The admission rang through the shelter like a bell, transforming everything. The prophecy was fulfilled, but not through destruction or sacrifice. Through love that had proven stronger than 8 centuries of darkness, creating something the supernatural world had never seen before, a redeemed monster who could protect the innocent without losing the strength to face their enemies. Everything had shifted. Victor Dracul, Vampire King, was dead. Victor Thorn, father and protector, had taken his place, gathering strength. The silence that followed Victor's declaration stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant sounds of supernatural warfare raging through Cedar Falls. Lady Seraphina pressed herself against the ruined wall, her ancient eyes fixed on the impossible tableau before her, a transformed vampire standing protectively over 2 children whose light now sang in harmony with his purified darkness. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of promises and threats. "The others will come. What you've become, it changes nothing." The prophecy spoke of redemption, not immunity. Before Victor could respond, she dissolved into shadow and mist, flowing through the cracks in the broken wall like spilled mercury. Her departure left behind only the acrid scent of sulphur and the echo of ancient malice. Emma tugged at Victor's sleeve, her young face creased with concern. "She's right, isn't she? There are more coming. I can feel them, angry, hungry things that want to hurt us for what we did to the old ones." Victor knelt beside the children, marveling at how his transformed nature allowed him to touch them without causing pain. Jake's small hand found his, and instead of the burning sensation that had marked their early contact, there was only warmth, natural, human warmth that spoke of acceptance and belonging. "Let them come," Victor said quietly, though his mind was already racing through the tactical implications. His transformation had given him unprecedented power, but it had also painted an even larger target on their backs. Every supernatural faction on the continent would want to study, control, or destroy what he had become. Father Coleman limped over, pressing a bloodied cloth against the worst of his wounds. The church tactical teams are still 8 minutes out, but they're reporting heavy resistance. Werewolf packs are engaging vampire forces in running battles through the town. And there are other things out there, older things that don't belong to any faction we recognize. Isabella's satellite phone buzzed with incoming intelligence. Her face grew progressively paler as she read the reports. "Victor, this is bigger than we thought. House Valdris has declared formal vendetta against you for destroying their allies. The European Council is mobilizing their entire enforcement division, and—" She paused, swallowing hard. "There are reports of demon sightings as far south as Denver. Whatever energy signature these children put out during your transformation, it's drawn attention from planes of existence that normally ignore our world entirely." Victor processed the information with the calculating precision that had kept him alive for 8 centuries. His territories were already lost. Marcus would be executing Protocol 7, systematically abandoning strongholds that had taken decades to establish. His vampire allies would either flee or switch sides rather than face the combined wrath of the supernatural world's most ancient powers. In purely strategic terms, his situation was hopeless. But as Jake leaned against his side with complete trust, and Emma stood sentinel with determination that belonged on a warrior 3 times her age, Victor felt something he hadn't experienced since his mortal life: absolute certainty of purpose. "We can't stay here," he said, rising to survey the ruined shelter. "This position is compromised, and reinforcements won't arrive in time to make a difference." "Where can we go?" Father Coleman asked. "Every safe house in the region will be watched. The church maintains emergency protocols, but nothing designed for threats of this magnitude." Victor's transformed mind worked through possibilities with newfound clarity. His old vampire instincts suggested going to ground, finding a defensible position, and waiting for the storm to pass. But his human heart, beating steadily in his chest, whispered of another option, one that would have been unthinkable before his redemption. "We don't run," he said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. "We gather our own allies." Isabella looked at him as if he'd suggested challenging the laws of physics. "What allies? Every supernatural faction wants these children dead or captured. The church can provide limited support, but they're one organization against an entire world of predators." Victor smiled, and for the first time in centuries, the expression held no trace of predatory calculation. Not supernatural allies, human ones. Emma's eyes widened as her enhanced awareness grasped the implications. "The town. You want to tell the people of Cedar Falls what's really happening." "More than tell them," Victor said, moving to the shattered window where he could see the lights of the small mountain community. "I want to give them the choice to stand with us. These children aren't just targets in some ancient supernatural war. They're part of this community now. Emma and Jake belong here, and the people of Cedar Falls deserve to know what's coming for their neighbors." Father Coleman stared at him with something approaching theological awe. "You're talking about breaking the veil, exposing the supernatural world to ordinary humans. The council is already mobilizing to destroy us," Victor interrupted. "But humans have something that vampires, werewolves, and demons often underestimate. They choose to protect what they love, even against impossible odds." Jake tugged at Victor's hand, his innocent eyes bright with understanding beyond his years. "Like how you chose to protect us, even when it meant giving up everything else." The simple truth of it settled over Victor like benediction. He had found his strength not in supernatural power or ancient alliances, but in the radical act of choosing love over fear. The real battle was just beginning. The weight of Victor's decision hung in the air like the last echoes of thunder. He stood at the broken window, watching Cedar Falls lights twinkle in the distance, each one representing a life that would be forever changed by what he was about to ask them to face. "You understand what this means?" Father Coleman said quietly, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who had spent years protecting the barriers between worlds. "Once the veil is broken, it can never be restored. Those people out there, they'll lose their innocence. Their safe, ordinary world will become something far more dangerous." Victor's newly beating heart clenched at the truth of it. For 8 centuries he had been part of the conspiracy that kept humanity ignorant of the monsters walking among them. It was a kindness in its way, letting them sleep peacefully while creatures like him handled the darkness that lurked beyond their comprehension. But as Emma's small hand slipped into his, he felt the certainty that had driven his transformation crystallize into unshakable resolve. These children deserved more than to be pawns in an ancient war. They deserved a community that chose to stand with them, eyes wide open to the consequences. "Every person in Cedar Falls will have to decide," he said, turning from the window to meet the others' stares. "Stay and fight for what they believe in, or leave before the real battle begins, but they'll make that choice knowing the truth." Isabella's tactical mind was already working through the implications. The exposure protocols alone will take hours to implement safely. We need to gather the town leadership. Mayor, sheriff, emergency services, and we need a defensible location for the presentation. The high school gymnasium, Victor said immediately. Large enough for the whole community, multiple exit routes, and far enough from residential areas to minimize civilian casualties if things go wrong. Emma's supernatural awareness suddenly flared with alarm. She turned toward the eastern wall, her young face pale with concentration. Something's coming, not the same as the others. This one feels older, hungrier. Through the settling snow outside, Victor caught the scent that made his transformed blood sing with recognition and dread. Brimstone and ancient malice, carrying undertones of sulfur that spoke of realms far beyond earthly concerns. Demon, Father Coleman breathed, his scarred hands already moving to his hidden arsenal of blessed weapons. True demon, not just supernatural hybrid. Victor's enhanced senses tracked the approaching presence, massive, patient, moving with the careful deliberation of something that viewed time in millennia rather than moments. This wasn't another vampire elder seeking revenge or werewolf pack claiming territory. This was something far worse, drawn by the energy signature of his transformation like a shark, scenting blood in dark waters. The gymnasium plan just became more urgent, he said grimly. We need those people gathered and informed before... The shelter's remaining walls exploded inward as something that should not exist in the physical realm forced its way into reality. Where the vampire elders had been beautiful in their predatory perfection, this entity was magnificently terrible. Ancient power, wrapped in a form that made human vision weep to perceive it directly. Jake whimpered and pressed against Victor's side as waves of supernatural dread washed over them. Even transformed, Victor felt his new mortality recoil from the presence of something that had been old when Rome was young, that had whispered in the ears of emperors and watched civilizations rise and fall like seasons. Victor Dracul, the demon's voice resonated through dimensions, each word carrying the weight of cosmic authority, the one who dared transform the natural order. I have come to witness this impossibility with my own perception. We're under church protection. Father Coleman stepped forward despite his wounds, silver crucifix blazing with holy light that seemed pitiful against such ancient darkness. This realm is sanctified ground. The demon's attention turned to the priest with something resembling amusement. Your authority extends to vampires and earthbound spirits, little shepherd. I am neither. I am interested only in the children whose bloodline resonates with frequencies that breach the barriers between worlds. Victor moved protectively in front of Emma and Jake, his transformed nature singing with defensive power. But even redeemed, even strengthened by love and sacrifice, he could feel the vast gulf between his abilities and the cosmic force now filling the ruined shelter. They're under my protection, he said simply, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to speak them anyway. The demon regarded him with eyes like dying stars. Yes, the great impossibility, a vampire king choosing redemption over power, love over hunger. It creates interesting resonances in the fabric of reality, its massive head tilted with predatory curiosity. Tell me, transformed one, was your mortality worth condemning these children to attention from beings far beyond your ability to face? The question hit Victor like a physical blow because it voiced his deepest fear. Had his transformation, born from love and sacrifice, actually made Emma and Jake less safe by drawing the attention of forces that operated beyond earthly concerns? Jake's small voice cut through his doubt like sunlight through storm clouds. He didn't condemn us. He saved us. And now we're going to save everyone else. The simple faith in those words reminded Victor why he had chosen this path. Not for certainty of victory, but for the chance to stand between innocence and the dark, whatever the cost. The real confrontation was no longer coming. It was here. The demon's laughter rolled through dimensions like distant thunder, each note resonating with frequencies that made reality itself shiver. Save everyone else? It repeated, its voice carrying mock delight. A child's faith in the face of cosmic inevitability. How refreshing. Victor felt his transformed nature respond to the entity's presence. every instinct screaming warnings about the magnitude of what they faced. This wasn't a battle that could be won through strength or speed or even love-purified power. This was a test of something far more fundamental, the choice between despair and hope when confronted with absolute impossibility. "Emma," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the demon, "take Jake and move toward Father Coleman." "No." Emma's voice carried surprising steel. "We're supposed to be together. That's what the light told me when you were changing. We're stronger when we're together." The demon's attention fixed on Emma with predatory interest. "The girl sees truly. Your transformation created a resonance between your natures. Vampire darkness redeemed by human love, bound to children whose light burns across dimensional barriers. You are no longer separate entities, but aspects of something new." Jake stepped closer to Victor, his small hand finding the transformed vampires with perfect trust. Where their skin touched, Victor felt it again, that sensation of completion, of power that was greater than the sum of its parts. "What do you want?" Victor demanded, though part of him already knew. Ancient entities like this didn't manifest without purpose, and that purpose was rarely benevolent. "To offer you truth," the demon replied, its form shifting like smoke given terrible substance. "Your transformation has indeed drawn attention from realms beyond earthly concern, but not merely predatory attention. We who observe the deep patterns of existence have seen the prophecy's true fulfillment." Father Coleman raised his crucifix higher, holy light blazing against the entity's darkness. "Whatever lies you're here to speak, I speak no lies, little shepherd. I speak the weight of cosmic law." The demon's gaze returned to Victor and the children. These two carry bloodlines that predate modern humanity. They are descendants of the first humans to successfully resist supernatural corruption, not through holy power or magical protection, but through the simple choice to remain compassionate in the face of darkness. Emma's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "That's why I can sense supernatural things, why Jake's touch burns vampires. We're not weapons, we're like living proof that humans can choose light over dark." "Precisely. And your protector's transformation represents something unprecedented, a supernatural entity choosing to be redeemed by that same human capacity for love." The demon's voice carried what might have been respect. "Together you three represent the possibility that the eternal war between light and darkness need not be eternal." Victor felt the pieces clicking together with terrifying clarity. That's why the vampire elders want them dead, why every supernatural faction is mobilizing. We don't just represent a threat to their power, we represent proof that their war itself might be unnecessary. "The cosmic balance trembles," the demon confirmed. "For millennia, the supernatural world has operated on the assumption that darkness must devour light or be devoured by it. You have created a third option, transformation, redemption, the possibility that enemies might become protectors through the radical act of choosing love over hunger." Jake tugged at Victor's hand, his innocent voice cutting through the metaphysical complexity. "So, are you here to hurt us or help us?" The demon's terrible form stilled, as if the child's directness had struck something vital. "I am here to offer you the same choice your transformation made possible, the chance to transcend the limitations of ancient law." Victor's mind raced through the implications. What kind of choice? Remain here and face the gathering supernatural armies with only mortal allies and transformed power. Accept that your stand will likely end in noble failure, but inspire others to follow your path across the coming centuries. The demon paused, letting the weight of sacrifice settle. "Or accept my aid in protecting these children, knowing that such aid comes with prices that reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself." Emma stepped forward, her young face grave with understanding beyond her years. "There's a third choice, isn't there? You wouldn't be here if there wasn't." The demon's eyes, twin voids that held the memory of creation's first darkness, fixed on her with something approaching wonder. The child sees what ancient minds miss. "Yes, there is a third path, one that requires not my aid, nor merely your sacrifice, but something far more dangerous." "What?" Victor asked, though his transformed heart already knew the answer would change everything. Trust in the very humans whose world you plan to shatter with truth. Trust that, when faced with the choice between comfortable ignorance and dangerous knowledge, they will choose to stand with innocence against the dark. The demon's voice carried the weight of eons. Trust them to become something they have never been before, supernatural allies who choose their involvement freely. The shelter fell silent except for the distant sounds of battle drawing closer. Victor looked down at Emma and Jake, saw his own determination reflected in their faces, and realized the ultimate test wasn't about power or sacrifice. It was about faith in humanity's capacity for the same choice that had redeemed him. The real battle was about to begin. Victor met the demon's cosmic gaze with unwavering resolve. "Then we choose trust." The words hung in the air like an incantation, and the demon's form rippled with what might have been surprise or approval. Even knowing that trust in humanity has failed every supernatural entity who has attempted it across the millennia? "Especially knowing that," Victor replied, his transformed heart beating steadily against the weight of cosmic doubt. "Emma, Jake, are you ready to show Cedar Falls who we really are?" Before either child could answer, the demon raised one terrible hand. The choice made, but not yet tested. They come. The night exploded with supernatural violence as the gathering forces finally converged on the ruined shelter. Through the shattered walls came the vampire elders Victor had expected, but behind them surged a nightmare parade of every faction that viewed their small family as an existential threat. Werewolf alphas bounded through the snow, their pack bonds singing with shared bloodlust. Ancient witches floated on currents of malevolent power, chanting in languages that predated written history. Fey nobles stepped sideways through reality itself, their alien beauty masking predatory intent that operated by rules no human mind could comprehend. "So many," Isabella breathed, her weapons already in hand despite the hopeless odds. Victor felt his redeemed nature surge in response to the threat, but he forced himself to remain still. This wasn't a battle to be won through violence. This was the moment when everything they had chosen to believe about humanity would be tested against the crushing weight of supernatural reality. "Father Coleman," he said quietly, "how quickly can we reach the gymnasium?" 10 minutes through the back streets if we move fast," the priest replied, understanding immediately. "But they'll track us." "They're supposed to track us." Victor's smile held grim determination. "We need every supernatural predator in the region to follow us directly to where the people of Cedar Falls are gathering." Emma's eyes blazed with sudden comprehension. "You're not just asking them to choose, you're making sure they see exactly what they're choosing between." The advancing supernatural army paused at the shelter's perimeter, seemingly content to form a tightening circle rather than attack immediately. Victor realized they were savoring this moment, the opportunity to demonstrate their overwhelming superiority before claiming their prize. Marcus Thornfield stepped forward from among the vampire elders, his ancient face twisted with the betrayal he felt at Victor's transformation. "Look at what you've become, my king. Mortal, weak, clinging to human children like a drowning man clutches driftwood." "I see exactly what I've become," Victor replied, gathering Emma and Jake close. "The question is whether you understand what you're about to destroy." The demon's presence shifted, becoming less threatening and more expectant, as if it too wanted to see how this unprecedented test would resolve. "We leave now," Victor announced to his small group. "No supernatural speed, no powers that might harm our human allies. We walk to the gymnasium like the mortals we're asking to trust us." Isabella stared at him as if he'd suggested suicide. "Victor, they'll follow us in force. We'll be leading every supernatural predator in North America directly into a building full of innocent people." "Yes," he agreed simply. "We'll be giving the people of Cedar Falls the chance to see exactly what stands against them. And then we'll discover what humans are truly capable of when they choose to fight for something greater than their own safety." Jake's small hand squeezed Victor's with absolute faith. "They'll choose right. People always choose right when they really understand what's happening. The advancing supernatural forces began to close their circle, moving with the patient confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. But Victor felt no fear, only the strange peace that came from absolute commitment to a path chosen with full knowledge of its consequences. "The town council received our message?" he asked Father Coleman. "Emergency gathering called for 8 p.m. Mayor Hendricks thinks it's about storm damage assessment." The priest's scarred hands were steady despite the approaching nightmare. They have no idea what they're about to face. Victor looked up at the demon, whose cosmic presence seemed to fill the space between worlds. "Will you witness what happens next?" "I will witness," the entity confirmed, its voice carrying across dimensions. The first time in existence that supernatural entities have chosen to place their fate entirely in mortal hands, trusting human nature against the evidence of millennia. The circle of predators tightened, supernatural power crackling through the air like approaching lightning. Victor lifted Emma into his arms, while Jake clung to his side, and together they stepped out of the ruined shelter into the snowy night. Behind them came their small group of allies. Ahead lay Cedar Falls' lights and the gymnasium where ordinary people were gathering for what they thought was a routine community meeting. And following in their wake came an army of supernatural predators, eager to demonstrate humanity's helplessness against forces beyond their comprehension. The ultimate test of faith was about to begin. The gymnasium's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the basketball court, where 53 residents of Cedar Falls had gathered for what they believed was an emergency town meeting about storm damage. Mayor Hendricks shuffled his papers at the fold-out table, completely unaware that outside in the December night, forces beyond human comprehension were converging on his small mountain community. Victor paused at the gymnasium's entrance, Emma in his arms and Jake pressed against his side. Through the glass doors, he could see ordinary people. The diner owner who had served him coffee that first night, the librarian who had helped Emma find books about her mother's condition, the postal worker who always smiled at Jake during their morning walks. Normal humans living normal lives, about to have their understanding of reality shattered forever. "Second thoughts," Isabella whispered, her enhanced senses tracking the supernatural army gathering in the shadows around the building's perimeter. "Every second," Victor admitted, then pushed open the doors. The conversation in the gymnasium died as their small group entered. Victor saw the moment when ordinary human perception tried to process what it was seeing, the children they'd grown to care about over recent weeks, accompanied by strangers whose very presence made instinctive alarms sound in the primitive depths of human consciousness. "Emma? Jake?" Mayor Hendricks stood slowly, his politician's instinct screaming warnings he couldn't quite articulate. "We weren't expecting you at the meeting, honey." Emma stepped forward with the grave dignity that had marked all her choices since her mother's death. "We need to tell you something important, all of you, about who Victor really is and what's coming." The gymnasium's back doors exploded inward as Marcus Thornfield and 3 other vampire elders glided inside with predatory grace. Their supernatural beauty hit the assembled humans like a physical force. Several people gasped, others stumbled backward, all of them suddenly understanding they were in the presence of apex predators wearing human faces. "Don't be afraid," Victor called out, his voice carrying across the gymnasium with calm authority. "They're here to make you an offer, the same offer they've made humanity for millennia." Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian, stood with surprising steadiness despite the terror radiating through the room. "What kind of offer?" Marcus smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Survival. Submit to our authority, accept your place as cattle in our protected herds, and we will ensure Cedar Falls continues to exist. Refuse." He gestured elegantly toward the doors as more supernatural entities began filing in. "Well, refusal has consequences." The were-alpha who entered next didn't bother with human pretense. 8 feet of muscle and primal hunger that made several people cry out in recognition of humanity's ancient fear of the hunting pack. Behind him came creatures that defied easy categorization, fey nobles whose alien beauty hurt to look at directly, witches whose very presence made the air crackle with malevolent energy, things that might once have been human, but had surrendered their humanity so long ago that only hunger remained. "You see?" Marcus continued, his voice carrying hypnotic undertones designed to encourage submission. "The supernatural world operates by very simple rules. The strong protect the weak in exchange for obedience and sustenance. We offer you the same arrangement we've offered countless human communities across the centuries." Victor stepped into the center of the basketball court, still holding Emma, while Jake stood proudly at his side. "They're not telling you about the third option." Mayor Hendricks found his voice, though it shook with the effort of remaining functional in the face of impossible reality. "What third option?" "The option I chose." Victor met the eyes of every human in the room, letting them see the truth he'd hidden behind mortal disguise. "I was Victor Dracul, Vampire King for 800 years. I ruled through fear and fed on human blood until 2 children asked me to be their father for a single night." The transformation began as he spoke, not the violent shift they'd witnessed at the shelter, but a gradual revelation of his true nature. His skin took on the pale luminescence of predatory perfection, his eyes darkened to ancient depths, his presence expanded to fill the gymnasium with the weight of centuries. "And I chose to give it all up," he continued, as gasps echoed through the crowd. "My immortality, my power, my kingdom, all of it. Because love offered something I'd never imagined possible, the chance to become something better than what I was." Emma's small voice carried clearly in the stunned silence. "We're not asking you to fight them for us. We're asking you to fight them with us." The supernatural predators began to laugh, until Jake stepped forward and placed his hand on Victor's arm. Where the child's innocent touch met redeemed vampire flesh, light blazed through the gymnasium. Not the harsh glare of the fluorescence, but warm radiance that spoke of hope choosing to stand against despair, of love refusing to yield to hunger. In that light, every human present could see the truth that would define their choice. They were not witnessing a battle between equally powerful forces. They were being offered the chance to tip the scales of an eternal war through the radical act of choosing courage over comfort. The real sacrifice was only beginning. The light from Jake's touch pulsed through the gymnasium for 3 heartbeats before fading, leaving behind a silence so profound that Victor could hear the snow striking the windows. 53 ordinary people stared at the tableau before them. A transformed vampire king, 2 children whose bloodlines carried the memory of humanity's first choice between light and darkness, and an army of supernatural predators waiting to see which way the scales would tip. Then Tom Martinez, the diner owner who had served Victor coffee that first night, stepped forward. His hands shook, but his voice held steady. "I've been running a diner for 30 years, fed truckers, tourists, locals, never once asked if any of them were human." His weathered face turned toward Marcus and the assembled predators. "Don't see why I should start taking orders about it now." Mrs. Patterson moved to stand beside him, her librarian's spine straight despite her 73 years. "These children have been coming to my library every day since their mother died, reading stories about families, about love conquering fear." She looked directly at the were-alpha whose massive form loomed over the basketball court. "Seems to me they've been preparing for this choice longer than any of us realized." The supernatural predators shifted uneasily. This wasn't the cowering submission they'd expected from revealed humans. Marcus's hypnotic voice carried a sharper edge when he spoke. "You don't understand the forces arrayed against you. We offer protection—" "From what?" Mayor Hendricks interrupted, surprising himself with his boldness. "From you? That's like the fire offering to protect us from burning." He gestured toward Victor and the children. This man, whatever he was, chose to become human for the sake of 2 orphaned kids. You're asking us to become less human for the sake of our own fear." Emma squeezed Victor's hand, her young face glowing with pride in the choices unfolding around them. "Tell them about the prophecy," she whispered. Victor's transformed heart clenched with the weight of what these humans were choosing to accept. The prophecy spoke of the Vampire King's redemption coming through protecting two souls whose light could either destroy him or grant him humanity. His voice carried to every corner of the gymnasium. But it never said the choice would end there. The demon materialized at the edge of the gathering, not with the cosmic terror it had displayed before, but as a presence that seemed to exist in the spaces between certainties. When it spoke, its words carried across dimensions. The prophecy continues. Through their protectors, transformation, and their own courage, those two souls would offer the same choice to others, the chance for any being to transcend the limitations of their nature through love. Jake stepped away from Victor's side and walked toward the nearest supernatural predator, a fey noble whose alien beauty made the air shimmer with otherworldly power. The creature tensed, expecting an attack, but the 6-year-old simply extended his small hand. "You could choose too, if you wanted to be different than what you are." The fey noble stared down at the child's offered hand, and for a moment something flickered across its inhuman features that might have been longing. But then Marcus's commanding presence reasserted itself, and the creature stepped back with a bitter laugh. "Children's games, mortal sentiment. These humans have sealed their fate with their defiance." The vampire elder raised his hand, power gathering around him like visible malevolence, and struck an invisible barrier that sent him staggering backward. He looked up in shock to find that every human in the gymnasium had moved to form a protective circle around Victor and the children. "No," said Dr. Sarah Chen, the town's physician, her medical training making her voice clinical, even in the face of supernatural power. "You've sealed yours, because you can't understand the one thing these children figured out from the beginning, which is." The were-alpha snarled, muscles bunching for attack. Sheriff Rodriguez answered, his hand resting not on his weapon, but on the shoulder of the child standing next to him. "Family isn't about blood or power or fear. It's about choosing to stand together when standing apart would be easier." The supernatural army pressed forward and found themselves unable to advance, not because of holy power or magical protection, but because 53 ordinary humans had made an extraordinary choice to believe that love could triumph over hunger, that hope could stand against despair, that the possibility of redemption was worth defending even at the cost of their lives. Victor felt tears he hadn't shed in 8 centuries sliding down his transformed face. Around him, the people of Cedar Falls stood firm against forces that had dominated humanity since the dawn of consciousness, united not by power, but by the simple recognition that some things were worth protecting regardless of the cost. The cosmic balance shifted with an almost audible sound, not toward light or darkness, but toward something entirely new. The age of choice had begun. The supernatural army froze as the cosmic shift rippled through reality itself. Victor watched in wonder as the invisible barrier formed by human choice blazed brighter with each passing second, fed not by magic or divine intervention, but by the simple, revolutionary act of ordinary people refusing to accept that love must yield to power. Marcus Thornfield's perfect vampiric features contorted with rage and something deeper, the terror of a predator realizing its prey had evolved beyond reach. "This changes nothing," he snarled, though his voice carried the hollow ring of desperate denial. "You are still mortal, still fragile, still human," Victor interrupted, stepping through the protective circle to face his former lieutenant. But he was no longer the vampire king who had ruled through fear, nor was he entirely the broken man who had collapsed outside a diner 3 weeks ago. He stood transformed, not into something superhuman, but into something far more dangerous to the old order, a being who had chosen love over power and found himself immeasurably stronger for the sacrifice. The were-alpha lunged forward with preternatural speed, claws extended to tear through the defiant mortals, and simply stopped, suspended in mid-air, as if the very universe had reconsidered the wisdom of allowing such violence against those who had chosen hope over submission. "The rules have changed," the demon observed, its cosmic presence now tinged with something that might have been satisfaction. "For the first time since consciousness began, a community of mortals has collectively chosen to believe that redemption is possible for any being willing to surrender what they were for what they might become." Jake walked to where the were-alpha hung suspended, his innocent eyes meeting the creature's bestial gaze. "It doesn't have to hurt anymore," he said softly. "Being angry all the time, being hungry for things that don't make you happy, you could choose something different." The massive creature's snarling expression flickered, and for a heartbeat, Victor glimpsed the broken human soul that had once sought power to escape its own pain. But centuries of conditioning reasserted themselves, and the were-alpha turned away from the child's offered grace. One by one, the supernatural predators began to withdraw, not in defeat, but in the sullen recognition that their prey had transcended the ancient relationship of predator and victim. They could no longer feed on fear from hearts that had chosen courage, could not dominate minds that understood their own power to reshape reality through love. "This isn't over," Marcus hissed as he reached the gymnasium doors. "You've won a single battle, not the war." Victor smiled, and the expression held 8 centuries of hard-won wisdom. "That's where you're wrong, old friend. We haven't won a battle. We've proven that the war was always unnecessary." As the supernatural army melted back into the night, the people of Cedar Falls slowly lowered their protective circle. The gymnasium fell silent except for the sound of soft weeping, not from fear, but from the overwhelming recognition of what they had just experienced together. Emma tugged on Victor's sleeve, and when he knelt to her level, she whispered, "Are we really safe now?" "Safer than we've ever been," he replied, gathering both children into his arms. "Not because the danger is gone, but because we've learned what we're capable of when we stand together." Mayor Hendricks cleared his throat, his politician's instincts struggling to process the evening's events. "I suppose we should discuss logistics, about the children, about what happens next." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her medical bag still clutched in one hand. "What happens next is we take care of our family. All of us." She looked around the gymnasium at faces still glowing with the aftermath of shared revelation. Cedar Falls just became something new, not just a town, but a place where anyone can choose to become more than they were. Mrs. Patterson nodded firmly. "The library will need new sections, books about hope, about transformation, about the kinds of families people choose rather than inherit." Tom Martinez laughed, the sound echoing off the gymnasium walls. "Guess I'd better expand the diner menu. Might be getting some unusual new residents if word spreads about what's possible here." Victor stood slowly, Emma and Jake still pressed against his sides, and looked around at the faces of people who had become his truest family, not through blood or supernatural bond, but through the radical choice to believe in each other's capacity for growth. "3 weeks ago, I came to Cedar Falls as a broken creature fleeing from 8 centuries of mistakes," he said quietly. "Tonight, I leave as something I never imagined I could become, not a king ruling through fear, but a father learning to serve through love." Sheriff Rodriguez stepped forward with a smile. "Who says anything about leaving? The adoption paperwork won't file itself, and those kids need stability." As laughter filled the gymnasium and ordinary people began planning extraordinary new lives together, Victor felt the final pieces of his transformation settling into place. He had returned to the world, not as the vampire king, but as Victor Dracul, single father, and newest permanent resident of Cedar Falls. The age of choice had begun, and it started with coming home, the new beginning. 6 months later, Victor stood at the kitchen window of their small house on Maple Street, watching Emma and Jake play in the backyard that had become a gathering place for half the neighborhood children. The morning sun felt warm on his skin, truly warm, not the painful reminder of his vampiric nature that it had once been. He still bore the physical markers of his transformation, the pale luminescence that appeared when emotions ran high, the ancient depth in his eyes that sometimes made strangers pause mid-conversation. But these were memories of what he'd been, not chains binding him to what he could never escape. "Dad, can we have pancakes?" Jake called through the screen door, his face flushed with the exertion of chasing Mrs. Patterson's grandson around the tire swing Tom Martinez had installed last month. "Dad." The word still sent warmth flooding through Victor's chest, not the desperate plea of two terrified children begging a stranger to save them, but the casual affection of kids secure in the knowledge that home would always be there when they needed it. "Only if you help Emma with the dishes afterward," Victor called back, smiling at Jake's dramatic groan of protest. The kitchen itself bore witness to their new reality. Adoption papers framed on the wall next to Emma's honor roll certificate and Jake's crayon drawing of their family. 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with an impossibly large heart floating above the roof. Victor had wept the day Jake brought that home from school, overwhelmed by the 6-year-old's matter-of-fact inclusion of his transformed father in the definition of normal happiness. A knock at the front door interrupted his morning reverie. Sheriff Rodriguez stood on the porch, his expression carrying the mix of professional concern and personal affection that had become familiar since the night everything changed. "Morning, Victor. Got time for coffee? There's something you should know about." They settled at the kitchen table while Victor poured coffee from the pot Tom had taught him to make, strong enough to wake the dead, but with the careful attention to detail that transformed simple acts into expressions of care. 3 families arrived yesterday, Rodriguez said without preamble. Different supernatural backgrounds, all of them asking about what happened here, words spreading through networks we didn't even know existed. Victor nodded thoughtfully. They'd expected this. Cedar Falls had become something unprecedented in supernatural society, a place where the ancient rules of predator and prey had been rewritten through collective human choice. It made sense that others seeking transformation would be drawn here. "What kind of families?" Victor asked, though his tone held no anxiety. The community that had stood together against an army of supernatural predators was more than capable of handling refugees seeking redemption. Vampire couple with a recently turned daughter they're trying to help adjust. A witch whose magic went dark after a personal tragedy. She's looking for a way back to who she used to be. And... Rodriguez paused, his weathered face creasing with something between concern and wonder. A former demon who claims it learned to choose differently by watching what happened here. Through the kitchen window, Victor could see Dr. Chen teaching Emma how to properly bandage Jake's scraped knee, a minor injury from his enthusiastic swing jumping that had been elevated to major medical drama through 6-year-old logic. The sight filled him with the quiet contentment that had replaced centuries of restless hunger. "The town council's meeting tonight," Rodriguez continued. "Mayor Hendricks wants to discuss how we handle integration, making sure everyone who comes here understands what we've built and what we expect." Victor smiled, remembering the shy businessman who had stumbled into Cedar Falls during a December blizzard. "Tell them we handle it the same way you handled me, with cautious compassion and the expectation that anyone can choose to become better than they were." After Rodriguez left, Victor returned to the backyard, where Emma was organizing an elaborate game involving all the neighborhood children. At 8.5, she'd grown into the role of protective older sister with natural grace. Her ability to sense supernatural beings now focused on helping rather than hiding. She looked up as he approached, her face glowing with the uncomplicated joy of a child secure in her father's love. "Jake says pancakes are happening," she announced solemnly. "Jake says a lot of things," Victor replied, scooping his son up as the boy launched himself toward the house with single-minded breakfast determination. As they moved toward the kitchen, children chattering about playground politics, sunlight streaming through windows of a home built on choice rather than circumstance, Victor felt the final echo of his old existence fade into memory. The Vampire King was gone, dissolved in the acid of daily tenderness and domestic responsibility. In his place stood Victor Dracul, single father and permanent resident of Cedar Falls, a man who had learned that true immortality wasn't measured in centuries, but in the love that echoes forward through generations of choices, creating ripples of hope in a world that desperately needed proof that redemption was always possible. The age of choice had begun with coming home. It would continue with staying.